What happens when the CEO, who built an empire on ruthless perfection, discovers that the person saving her company isn't in the boardroom, but in the janitor's closet? When Evelyn Cross walked into her office kitchen at 2 a.m. and found a night custodian cooking meals for her exhausted engineers, she was ready to fire him on the spot. But his quiet answer stopped her cold. Someone has to take care of them. In the brutal fight to close a $240 million deal, she's about to learn that sometimes the strongest leaders aren't the ones who demand more. They're the ones who see when people have nothing left to give. If you want to see how far this story reaches, hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. The glass walls of Halcyon Dynamics reflected nothing but darkness at 2 in the morning. Evelyn Cross stood in her corner office on the 47th floor, staring down at the city below, her jaw tight with the kind of tension that had become her default setting. The skyline glittered like scattered diamonds, indifferent to the war being waged inside this building. Her company. Her reputation hanging by a thread so thin it might snap if someone breathed on it wrong. The Meridian deal was supposed to be a triumph. $240 million. A contract that would cement Halcyon's position as the dominant force in aerospace defense technology for the next decade. Instead, it had become a nightmare of missed deadlines, technical failures, and an engineering team that was visibly crumbling under the pressure she kept piling on. Evelyn pressed her fingers against the window, feeling the cold seep through the glass. She'd built this company from nothing. 15 years of clawing her way up through an industry that still looked at women in leadership and saw weakness to exploit. She'd learned early that softness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every decision, every move, every word had to be calculated, sharp, uncompromising. She didn't apologize for it, she didn't regret it. But lately, something felt wrong. The numbers weren't adding up the way they should. Team B, the one handling the core prototype development, was hemorrhaging talent. In the last month alone, 3 senior engineers had quit without notice. The remaining ones looked like ghosts, hollow-eyed, jittery, running on fumes and sheer desperation. She'd pushed them hard before. That was nothing new. But this time, the harder she pushed, the more things seemed to fall apart. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Chen, her VP of Operations. Another delay. Firmware integration failing QA. Need at least 48 more hours. Evelyn's fingers curled into a fist. 48 hours they didn't have. The Meridian Review Board was scheduled to arrive in less than a week. If the prototype wasn't ready, if it wasn't flawless, the contract would evaporate. And with it, the confidence of their investors, the stability of their stock price, and her own credibility as the CEO who never missed a target. She typed back with brutal efficiency. Not acceptable. Find a solution. Now. She didn't wait for a response. She grabbed her blazer from the back of her chair and headed for the elevator. If Marcus couldn't fix this, she'd do it herself. That was always the answer. Control the situation. Remove the obstacles. Don't trust anyone to care as much as you do. The building was eerily quiet at this hour. Most of the staff had gone home, or at least the ones who still had the sense to maintain some boundary between work and life. But as Evelyn descended toward the engineering wing on the 32nd floor, she could see lights still burning in several offices, shadows moving behind frosted glass, the hum of machinery and the faint clatter of keyboards. Good. They were still working. She walked past the main engineering bay, scanning the room through the glass partition. A dozen workstations, half of them occupied. Young faces illuminated by the glow of multiple monitors, surrounded by empty energy drink cans and crumpled food wrappers. One woman, Sarah Kim, one of their best systems analysts, had her head down on her desk, her shoulders rising and falling with the slow rhythm of someone who'd passed out mid-task. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something cold twisted in her chest. She kept walking. The break room was at the end of the hall, past the server room and the storage closets. She wasn't sure why she was heading there. Maybe because she needed coffee. Maybe because she needed a minute to think without someone asking her for answers she didn't have. But as she rounded the corner, she stopped short. The door was open, and inside someone was cooking. The smell hit her first. Garlic, onions, something savory and rich that had no business existing in a corporate break room at 2 in the morning. Evelyn's hand went to the doorframe as she stepped inside, her eyes narrowing. A man stood at the counter with his back to her, stirring something in a large pot on a portable electric burner. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the dark blue uniform of the building's night cleaning crew. His movements were calm, deliberate, the kind of ease that came from muscle memory. Next to the burner sat a row of glass containers, meal prep boxes, neatly lined up, each one filled with rice, roasted vegetables, and what looked like chunks of braised chicken. Evelyn's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "What the hell is this?" The man didn't jump. He didn't even turn around immediately. He just kept stirring for another few seconds, then clicked off the burner and set down the spoon before finally looking at her. He was older than she'd expected. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. His face had the kind of weathered quality that came from years of hard work, but his eyes were steady, unflinching, not defiant exactly, just calm. Like he'd already considered every possible reaction she might have and had decided none of them were worth panicking over. "Dinner," he said simply. Evelyn stared at him. "Dinner. For the engineering team." He gestured toward the meal prep containers. "They've been running on vending machine snacks and caffeine for 3 days straight. Figured they could use something real." Her jaw tightened. "You're a custodian." "I am." "Not a chef, not catering staff, you clean floors." "I do." "Then what the hell are you doing cooking in my break room?" He tilted his head slightly, studying her with that same unshakable calm. "Someone has to take care of them." The words landed harder than they should have. Evelyn felt something flicker in her chest, something she didn't have time for. She stepped further into the room, her heels clicking against the linoleum. "This is a corporate facility," she said, her tone cold and clipped. "You don't have authorization to use company equipment for personal projects. And you sure as hell don't have authorization to distribute food to employees without going through proper channels." The man, she glanced at his name tag, Nolan Hayes, didn't flinch. "I'm not using company equipment. I brought the burner and the ingredients from home. And I'm not charging anyone. I'm just making sure they don't collapse before they finish the job you're asking them to do." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Nolan met her gaze without hesitation. "You've got a team of 23 people down that hallway who've been working 70, 80-hour weeks for over a month. Half of them look like they're about to keel over. I've been cleaning these floors for 2 years, and I've never seen it this bad." "That's not your concern." "Maybe it should be someone's." The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Evelyn's pulse kicked up, her fingers curling at her sides. She wasn't used to being challenged, not by her executives, not by her board, and sure as hell not by the night janitor. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice dropping to something dangerously quiet. "Nolan Hayes." "Well, Nolan Hayes, let me make something very clear. I don't care how noble you think you're being. This company has protocols, health and safety regulations, liability concerns. You don't get to waltz in here and play Good Samaritan just because you think you know better." Nolan didn't argue. He just looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to the containers and started sealing them with plastic lids. "I'll be out of your way in a minute." Evelyn opened her mouth to snap at him again, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way his hands moved, practiced, efficient, no wasted motion. Maybe it was the fact that he didn't seem remotely intimidated by her, which was so rare it almost felt like a slap. Or maybe it was the smell of the food, warm and real, and so out of place in this sterile, high-pressure environment that it made her stomach twist with something she didn't want to name. She turned on her heel and walked out, but as she headed back down the hallway, she couldn't shake the image of those meal prep boxes, or the look in Nolan Hayes' eyes when he'd said, "Someone has to take care of them." The next morning, Evelyn arrived at her office at 6:30, her usual time. She'd barely slept. The conversation with Nolan kept replaying in her head, and she hated that it bothered her. She hated that she'd let him get under her skin. She dropped her bag on her desk and pulled up the employee directory, typing in his name. Nolan Hayes, custodial staff. 2 years with the company. No disciplinary notes, no performance complaints. Just a quiet, unremarkable file for a quiet, unremarkable man who cleaned floors and apparently thought he had the right to question how she ran her business. Her phone buzzed. Marcus again. "Good news. Team pushed through. Firmware stable. Running final tests now." Evelyn exhaled slowly. Finally. Something going right. She spent the rest of the morning in back-to-back meetings, budget reviews, investor calls, a tense conversation with the legal team about contract contingencies. By the time lunch rolled around, she'd almost managed to push Nolan Hayes out of her mind. Almost. But then she walked past the engineering wing again, and something caught her eye. The team was still there, still working, but the energy in the room felt different, less frantic. A few of them were actually eating real food from glass containers that looked suspiciously like the ones she'd seen in the break room the night before. Sarah Kim was awake, her posture straighter, her eyes clearer. One of the junior developers was laughing at something on his screen, a sound so unexpected in this building that it almost made Evelyn stop in her tracks. She kept walking, but the image stayed with her. That evening, Evelyn stayed late again. It was her default. She didn't have anywhere else to be. No one waiting for her at home. No hobbies, no distractions. Work was the only thing that mattered, the only thing she was good at. At 9 o'clock, she grabbed her tablet and headed down to the engineering floor to check on the prototype testing. As she approached the main lab, she heard voices, low, tired, but steady. She paused outside the door. "Seriously, I don't know how he does it," one of the engineers was saying. It sounded like David Tron, one of the hardware specialists. "But I swear to God, that chicken last night saved my life. I was about to lose it." "Right?" Sarah's voice. "I didn't even realize how bad I felt until I ate something that didn't come out of a vending machine. It's like my brain finally woke up." Another voice chimed in. Marcus. "He's been doing it for a week now. Just shows up around midnight with a whole batch of meals, doesn't ask for anything, doesn't make a big deal out of it. Just leaves the food and goes back to work." "Who even is he?" David asked. "Night custodian," Sarah said. "I asked him once why he was doing it. He said he used to work in restaurants. Said he knows what it's like to run on empty." There was a pause. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter. "I tried to tell him he didn't have to keep doing it. He just smiled and said, 'I know.'" Evelyn's fingers tightened around her tablet. She turned and walked back to her office without going inside. The next few days passed in a blur. The prototype moved through testing. The firmware held. The review board confirmed their visit. Everything was on track. But Evelyn couldn't stop noticing things. Team B, the one Nolan had been feeding, was outperforming every other group in the company. Their error rates were lower. Their collaboration was smoother. They weren't just surviving the pressure. They were handling it. Meanwhile, Team A, the group working on the secondary integration, was falling apart. 2 more people called in sick. One engineer had a breakdown in a meeting, snapping at a colleague over something trivial before storming out. The atmosphere was toxic, brittle, ready to shatter. Evelyn sat in her office, staring at the performance metrics on her screen, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Doubt. She'd always believed that pressure forged excellence, that the best people rose to the challenge and the weak ones fell away. It was Darwinian, it was efficient, it worked, didn't it? But the data in front of her told a different story. The team that was being cared for, fed, seen, supported in the smallest, most human way, was thriving. The team that wasn't. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her jaw tight. Someone has to take care of them. Nolan's words echoed in her head, stubborn and impossible to ignore. It was almost midnight when Evelyn found herself walking back to the break room. She told herself she was just checking on things, making sure everything was secure. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. She knew he'd be there, and he was. Nolan stood at the counter again, this time slicing vegetables with the kind of precision that spoke to years of practice. The portable burner was heating a pan, garlic sizzling in olive oil. The smell was intoxicating. Evelyn stopped in the doorway, her arms crossed. "You're still doing this?" Nolan glanced up, unsurprised. "I am. Even though I told you to stop." "You told me it was against protocol. You didn't tell me to stop." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't play word games with me." He set down the knife and turned to face her fully. "I'm not playing anything. I'm just doing what needs to be done." "Why?" The question came out sharper than she intended, but Nolan didn't flinch. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Because I've been where they are," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to be so tired you can't think straight, To feel like you're just a cog in a machine that doesn't care if you break. And I know what it's like when someone shows up and reminds you that you're not. Evelyn's chest tightened. This isn't a charity, Hayes, it's a business. I know. Then why are you treating it like a soup kitchen? Nolan's gaze didn't waver. Because businesses are still run by people. And people fall apart when no one's paying attention. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Evelyn wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he didn't understand how the world worked, that sentiment didn't build empires. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She turned and walked out without another word. But this time, the image of those meal prep boxes didn't just stay with her. It followed her all the way home. The breaking point came 3 days later. It started with a system failure, a catastrophic one. The prototype's navigation algorithm crashed during a critical integration test, wiping hours of work and exposing a flaw in the core architecture that no one had caught. The review board was due in 48 hours. 48 hours to fix a problem that should have taken weeks to solve. Evelyn went into crisis mode. She called an emergency meeting, pulling in every senior engineer, every department head, every person who had even a peripheral connection to the project. The conference room was packed, the air thick with tension. I don't care what it takes, Evelyn said, her voice like ice. We fix this. We work around the clock. We do not sleep until this is solved. Am I clear? Silence. Then Marcus spoke, his voice careful. Evelyn, the team's already running on fumes. If we push any harder, then they'll push harder, she snapped. This is what we signed up for. This is the job. If they can't handle it, they shouldn't be here. More silence. She dismissed the meeting and stormed back to her office, her hands shaking with fury and frustration. For the next 36 hours, the building became a war zone. People worked through the night, through meals, through exhaustion. Evelyn was everywhere, micromanaging, demanding updates, refusing to accept anything less than perfection. But perfection didn't come. Mistakes piled up. Tempers flared. One engineer misconfigured a subsystem and set the timeline back another 6 hours. Another made a coding error that corrupted a backup file. The harder Evelyn pushed, the worse things got. And then, at 3 a.m. on the day before the review, it happened. Evelyn was walking through the engineering wing when she saw him. A young developer, Brandon Lee, fresh out of MIT, one of the brightest minds on the team, sitting in the hallway with his back against the wall, his head in his hands. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. He was just sitting there, staring at nothing. Evelyn stopped. Lee, get back to work. He didn't respond. Lee. Nothing. She crouched down in front of him, her voice sharp. What's wrong with you? Brandon finally looked up. His eyes were red, glassy, empty. I can't, he whispered. Can't what? I can't think. I can't do this anymore. Evelyn stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. She opened her mouth to tell him to pull himself together, to stop being weak, to do his job. But the words wouldn't come. Because looking at him, at this brilliant, talented kid who'd been ground down to nothing, she saw the truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. Her leadership wasn't saving the company. It was breaking the people holding it up. She stood slowly, her hands trembling. And for the first time in 15 years, Evelyn Cross didn't know what to do. She found Nolan in the break room an hour later. He was packing up meals again, same as always. Calm, steady, unbothered by the chaos raging around him. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. She felt raw, exposed, like someone had peeled back a layer of armor she didn't know she'd been wearing. They're falling apart, she said quietly. Nolan looked up. I know. I don't know how to stop it. He studied her for a long moment, then set down the container he was holding. You can't stop it by pushing harder. That's what got you here. Then what do I do? Nolan's expression softened just slightly. You start by seeing them, not as resources, not as obstacles, as people. Evelyn's throat tightened. I don't know how. Then learn. He picked up one of the meal containers and held it out to her. Start with this. She stared at the container, then at him. What is this supposed to prove? Nothing. It's just food, but sometimes that's enough. Evelyn took the container, her hands shaking, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt the weight of everything she'd built and everything it had cost. Evelyn didn't eat this food right away. She carried it back to her office and set it on her desk, staring at it like it might explode. The container sat there under the harsh fluorescent lights, steam still rising faintly from the edges, and she felt something close to anger bubbling up inside her. Not at Nolan, at herself, for not knowing what the hell to do with a simple act of kindness. She'd spent 15 years building walls, 15 years learning to see people as variables in an equation, inputs and outputs, performance metrics and cost-benefit analyses. It was clean. It was efficient. It kept her safe. But now, standing in her pristine corner office, with a container of homemade food in her hands, those walls felt less like protection and more like a prison. She opened the lid. The smell hit her immediately. Garlic, herbs, chicken braised until it fell apart. Real food. The kind someone's hands had touched, not something pulled from a freezer and microwaved by a cafeteria worker who didn't care. She picked up the fork Nolan had tucked inside and took a bite. It was good. Better than good. It was the kind of meal that made you realize how long you'd been running on empty. Evelyn set down the fork and pressed her palms against her desk, her chest tight. She didn't cry. She didn't do that anymore. But something inside her cracked just enough to let the exhaustion in, and for a moment she let herself feel it. Then her phone buzzed, and the moment shattered. Marcus. Another update. Another problem. The navigation algorithm was still unstable. They'd patched the crash, but the underlying flaw was deeper than anyone had anticipated. The team was running simulations, but every fix introduced new variables, new risks. They were chasing their own tails. Evelyn grabbed her blazer and headed back down to the engineering floor. When she walked into the main lab, the scene was worse than she'd expected. The room smelled like stale coffee and sweat. Monitors glowed in the dim light, displaying lines of code and diagnostic readouts that meant nothing to her, but everything to the people staring at them with hollow eyes. Sarah Kim was at her workstation, her fingers flying across the keyboard, but her movements were jerky, uncoordinated. David Tran sat slumped in his chair, staring at his screen like he was trying to will the answer into existence through sheer force of desperation. And Brandon Lee was gone. His workstation was dark, his chair empty. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She walked over to Marcus, who was standing near the server racks with his arms crossed, his face drawn. "Where's Lee?" she asked. Marcus glanced at her, then away. "Sent him home. We don't have time for that." "He couldn't function, Evelyn. He was making mistakes, bad ones. I had to pull him before he caused more damage." She wanted to argue, but the words stuck in her throat, because Marcus was right, and that realization sat in her stomach like a stone. "How bad is it?" she asked instead. Marcus rubbed a hand over his face. "Bad. We've isolated the flaw, but fixing it without breaking something else is like performing surgery with a sledgehammer. We need another 12 hours minimum, maybe more." "We don't have 12 hours. I know." Evelyn looked around the room at the people who'd given everything they had and were now scraping the bottom of a barrel that had been empty for days. She thought about Brandon in the hallway, about the food Nolan had been quietly distributing, about the difference between the team that was falling apart and the one that wasn't. "They need to rest," she said quietly. Marcus blinked. "What?" "I said they need to rest. Send half of them home. Rotate shifts. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. No one works more than 8 consecutive hours." Marcus stared at her like she'd just suggested they cancel the contract and burn the building down. "Evelyn, we're 36 hours from the review. If we pull people now, if we don't pull people now, they're going to collapse, and then we'll have nothing. This isn't like you." "I know." She met his eyes. "Do it anyway." Marcus hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll set up the rotation." "And Marcus?" He paused. "Make sure they eat. Real food, not vending machine garbage." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe? Or confusion. But he didn't question it. He just nodded again and walked away. Evelyn stood there for a moment watching the team work and felt the weight of her own inadequacy pressing down on her shoulders. She'd built this company on the belief that strength meant never bending, never compromising, never admitting weakness. But looking at these people, brilliant, dedicated, and utterly spent, she realized that strength without compassion wasn't strength at all. It was just cruelty dressed up in a suit. She turned and walked out, her mind already racing ahead to the next problem, the next crisis. But as she passed the break room, she stopped. Nolan was gone. The counter was clean, the portable burner packed away, but sitting on the table were a dozen more meal containers, neatly stacked and labeled with names written in neat, blocky handwriting. Sarah, David, Marcus, Brandon. Evelyn stared at them, her throat tight. Then she pulled out her phone and sent a message to building security. Need night custodial staff files. Specifically, Nolan Hayes. Send to my office ASAP. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe she just needed to understand who this man was, why he gave a damn when no one else did. Or maybe she needed to prove to herself that there was some ulterior motive, some angle she'd missed. Either way, she needed answers. The file arrived 20 minutes later. Evelyn opened it at her desk, skimming through the standard employment records. 2 years with the company, consistent performance reviews. No complaints, no incidents, nothing remarkable. But there was a note at the bottom, something HR had flagged during the initial background check. Previous employment, executive chef, Bellamy and Company, upscale restaurant in the city. 5 years. Left voluntarily. Evelyn frowned. An executive chef working as a night janitor? That didn't make sense. She dug deeper, pulling up public records, social media profiles, anything she could find. It took another hour, but eventually the pieces started to come together. Nolan Hayes had been a rising star in the culinary world. Articles from food magazines, reviews praising his innovative menus, photos of him in chef's white standing in sleek modern kitchens. Then 7 years ago, everything stopped. No more articles, no more photos, just silence. Evelyn kept searching until she found it. An obituary. Emily Hayes. Survived by her husband, Nolan, and daughter, Claire. Cause of death. Complications from cancer. And suddenly, it all made sense. Evelyn sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. Nolan hadn't just walked away from his career, he'd sacrificed it. Given up everything he'd built to take care of his daughter, to be there for her in a way no restaurant schedule would ever allow. And now, years later, he was working night shifts cleaning floors, doing work that was beneath his skill level, just to make ends meet. And still, somehow, he found the energy to take care of people who weren't even his responsibility. Evelyn closed the file, her hand shaking. She didn't know what to do with this information. Didn't know how to reconcile the image of the quiet custodian with the man who'd once commanded a kitchen, who'd once had a life and a family and a future that had been ripped away from him. All she knew was that Nolan Hayes had lost everything and still chose to show up for other people. While she, who'd lost nothing, couldn't even see the people standing right in front of her. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at the office to find Marcus waiting outside her door. He looked exhausted but steady, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite place. "The rotation worked," he said without preamble. "Team's sharper. Error rate dropped by 40% overnight. We might actually pull this off." Evelyn nodded, relief flooding through her. "Good. Keep it going." Marcus hesitated. "There's something else." "What?" "HR got a complaint about the meals." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "From who?" "Operations manager says it's a health code violation, unauthorized food distribution, liability risk." Marcus's jaw tightened. "They want to shut it down, and they want to discipline Hayes." Evelyn felt a surge of anger so sharp it almost took her breath away. "Are you kidding me? I wish I was. They're saying if he keeps doing it, they'll terminate him. For feeding people. For breaking protocol." Evelyn stood, grabbing her phone. "Set up a meeting with HR, now." "Evelyn?" "Now, Marcus." He left without another word. 20 minutes later, Evelyn was sitting across from Patricia Langford, the head of HR, in a sterile conference room that smelled like recycled air and bureaucracy. Patricia was in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of polished professionalism that masked a complete lack of imagination. "Ms. Cross," Patricia began, her tone clipped, "I understand you wanted to discuss the situation with Mr. Hayes." "There's no situation," Evelyn said flatly. "There's a man doing something good, and you're trying to punish him for it." Patricia's expression didn't change. With all due respect, Mr. Hayes is violating multiple company policies. Health and safety regulations require that any food distributed on company property be prepared in a licensed facility and handled according to proper procedures. What he's doing exposes us to significant liability. He's feeding people who are too exhausted to feed themselves. That's not his responsibility. Then whose is it? Patricia blinked, clearly taken aback. I'm sorry. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice cold. Whose responsibility is it to make sure our people don't collapse? Who's supposed to care when they're working 80-hour weeks and running on fumes? You? Me? Or do we just pretend it's not happening until someone ends up in the hospital? Ms. Cross, this isn't about compassion. It's about policy. Policy is killing this company, Evelyn snapped. I've watched 3 people quit in the last month. I've watched brilliant engineers turn into zombies because we're grinding them into the ground. And the one person who's actually trying to help is the one you want to fire? Patricia straightened, her voice hardening. If you want to implement a meal program, we can discuss that. But Mr. Hayes does not have the authority to take matters into his own hands. If he continues, we will have no choice but to terminate his employment. Evelyn stared at her, fury and frustration warring inside her chest. She wanted to scream, to flip the table, to tell Patricia exactly what she thought of her and her precious policies. But she didn't, because losing control wouldn't solve anything. Instead, she stood. Fine, I'll handle it. Patricia looked confused. Handle it how? That's not your concern. Meeting over. Evelyn walked out before Patricia could respond. She found Nolan that night in the hallway outside the break room. He was pushing a cleaning cart, methodically working his way through the offices with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. When he saw her, he stopped but didn't speak. Evelyn crossed her arms. HR wants to fire you. Nolan nodded slowly. I figured. You figured, that's it? I knew the risks. Then why do you keep doing it? Nolan set down the mop he'd been holding and looked at her. Because it matters. To who? The company doesn't care. HR doesn't care. Half the people eating your food probably don't even know your name. I know. Then why? Nolan was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady. Because I used to be one of them. The people working themselves to death because they thought they had to. The people who didn't know how to stop or didn't think they deserved to. And no one showed up for me. Not until it was too late. His voice softened. So yeah, maybe they don't know my name, maybe they never will. But if I can give them one less thing to worry about, one moment where they don't feel completely alone, then it's worth it. Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to argue with someone whose motives were so painfully, impossibly pure. They're going to fire you if you don't stop, she said quietly. I know. And you're going to keep doing it anyway. Nolan smiled faintly. Probably. Evelyn shook her head, something close to disbelief washing over her. You're either the most stubborn person I've ever met or the most reckless. Maybe both. She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen in anyone in a long time. Conviction. Not the kind that came from ego or ambition, but the kind that came from knowing exactly who you were and refusing to compromise on it. I read your file, she said. Nolan's expression shifted just slightly. Did you? You're a chef, a good one. Long time ago. Why'd you leave? He hesitated, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something raw in his eyes. Pain, maybe. Or grief. My wife got sick, cancer. We had a daughter, 7 years old at the time, and I had a choice. Keep working 70-hour weeks in a kitchen and miss what time we had left, or step away and be there for them. He paused. Wasn't really a choice at all. Evelyn's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Don't be. I got 4 more years with her. That's more than a lot of people get. His voice was steady, but she could hear the weight beneath it. After she passed, I stayed home with Claire, raised her myself, did odd jobs to keep the bills paid. When she finally went off to college last year, I needed something steady, something simple. This fit. You're overqualified to be pushing a mop, maybe, but it pays the rent. And it keeps me busy. He met her eyes. And every now and then, I get to do something that matters. Evelyn looked down, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She thought about the last 15 years of her life, all the things she'd sacrificed in the name of success, relationships, friendships, any semblance of a life outside these walls. She'd told herself it was worth it, that the empire she'd built justified the cost. But standing here, listening to Nolan talk about choosing his family over his career, she wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Care. About people. The way you do." She looked up at him. "I built this company by being ruthless, by never letting sentiment get in the way. And it worked. But now I look at what's happening, and I don't know how to fix it without tearing down everything I've spent my life building." Nolan studied her for a long moment. "You don't have to tear it down. You just have to make room for something else." "Like what?" "Like the idea that people aren't machines, that pushing harder isn't always the answer, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you were wrong." Evelyn flinched. The words hit harder than she expected because they were true. And she hated that they were true. "I can't protect you from HR," she said finally. "Not if you keep breaking the rules." "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" Nolan picked up his mop again. "Nothing. I'm just asking you to see what I see. That the people in this building aren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They're human. And humans break when you stop treating them like they matter." He walked away, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the hallway with his words echoing in her head. The review board arrived 2 days later. Evelyn stood in the main conference room, immaculate in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back, her expression calm and controlled. Around the table sat 6 representatives from Meridian Defense, senior executives, engineers, contract specialists. People who held the future of Halcyon Dynamics in their hands. Marcus was at her side, along with Sarah Kim and 2 other senior engineers. The prototype sat on the table between them, sleek and compact, its casing gleaming under the lights. The lead representative, a man named Gerald Shu, leaned forward. "Ms. Cross, we've reviewed the preliminary data. The results are promising, but we need to see it in action." "Of course." Evelyn nodded to Sarah, who powered up the device. For the next 2 hours, they ran through every test, every scenario, every failure point Meridian could throw at them. The navigation algorithm held. The firmware integration was flawless. The hardware responded exactly as designed. It wasn't perfect. There were still minor bugs, small inefficiencies that would need to be ironed out in production. But it was good enough, more than good enough. Then, when the tests were finished, Gerald sat back, exchanging glances with his colleagues. "I'll be honest, Ms. Cross. After the delays, we had concerns, but this is impressive work." Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. "We don't do anything halfway." "Clearly." Gerald stood, extending his hand. "We'll have the contracts finalized by end of week. Congratulations." Evelyn shook his hand, feeling the tension that had been coiled in her chest for weeks finally begin to unwind. "Thank you." As the Meridian team filed out, Marcus let out a breath he'd probably been holding since the meeting started. "We did it." "We did," Evelyn said. But the victory felt hollow, because as she looked at Sarah, at the dark circles under her eyes, and the way her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion, she knew the cost had been too high. That night, Evelyn stayed late again. The building was quiet, the crisis finally over, the team sent home to rest for the first time in weeks. She sat in her office, staring out at the city, and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. They'd won, but it didn't feel like winning. She thought about Nolan, about the meals he'd cooked, about the way he'd shown up night after night even when it cost him. She thought about Brandon in the hallway, about the engineers who'd quit, about the cracks in the foundation she'd spent so long pretending didn't exist. And she realized something. The company didn't need a CEO who could close deals and crush deadlines. It needed a leader who could see people. Evelyn stood, grabbed her coat, and walked out of her office. She took the elevator down to the 32nd floor, past the now empty engineering wing, and stopped outside the break room. Nolan was there, as she'd known he would be, cleaning counters, stacking chairs, doing the work no one else thought about. He looked up when she walked in. "Heard the review went well." "It did." "Congratulations." Evelyn crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. I need to ask you something. Nolan set down the rag he'd been holding. Okay. If I could change things here, really change them, what would that look like? He tilted his head, considering. You want the polite answer or the honest one? Honest. People need to be seen, not just as workers, but as whole human beings. That means rest, real breaks, support systems that don't wait until someone's already broken to kick in. He paused. And it means leadership that actually gives a damn. Evelyn nodded slowly. What if I told you I'm trying? Then I'd say that's a start. She met his eyes. I don't want you to lose your job over this. I'm not worried about it. You should be. Nolan smiled faintly. I've lost bigger things. And there it was again. That unshakable calm, that refusal to be anything other than exactly who he was. It made Evelyn feel small and inadequate and strangely hopeful all at once. Thank you, she said quietly, for what you did. For the team. I didn't do it for thanks. I know, but you have it anyway. She turned to leave, but Nolan's voice stopped her. Ms. Cross? She looked back. The fact that you're asking these questions? That's more than most people in your position ever do. Evelyn didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded and walked away, Nolan's words following her all the way to the elevator. She didn't have all the answers yet, didn't know how to fix everything that was broken, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was finally asking the right questions. The contract with Meridian was signed 4 days later. $240 million spread across 3 years with performance benchmarks that would keep Halcyon afloat, and then some. The board was ecstatic. Investors were calling. The trade publications were already drafting headlines about Evelyn Cross's latest triumph. But Evelyn barely noticed. She sat in the celebratory board meeting, nodding in the right places, saying the right things, while her mind was somewhere else entirely. She kept thinking about Brandon Lee sitting in that hallway, about the way his eyes had looked, empty, hollowed out, like someone had scooped everything human out of him and left only exhaustion behind. She thought about Sarah Kim passed out at her desk, about the engineers who'd quit without warning, about the ones who'd stayed but probably shouldn't have. And she thought about Nolan Hayes, standing in a break room at 2 a.m, cooking food for people who weren't his responsibility because someone had to care. The meeting ended. People shook her hand, clapped her on the shoulder, told her she was brilliant. She smiled and accepted their praise and felt nothing. When she finally escaped back to her office, she closed the door and leaned against it, her eyes shut. The silence was heavy, oppressive. She'd spent 15 years chasing moments like this, the big wins, the validation, the proof that she was as good as she needed to be, but right now all she felt was tired. Her phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. HR pushing back on Hayes again. They want him gone by end of week. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She typed back quickly. Schedule a meeting with Patricia. Tomorrow morning. And pull the employment contract language on wellness initiatives. Marcus's response came a moment later. You sure about this? No, do it anyway. She set the phone down and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. Somewhere down there, Nolan was probably getting ready for another night shift, packing meals he'd cooked on his own time, preparing to show up for people who didn't even know his last name. And here she was, sitting in a corner office 47 floors up, trying to figure out how to protect him from a system she'd built. The irony wasn't lost on her. The next morning, Evelyn walked into the HR conference room with a folder under her arm and a plan that was half-formed at best. Patricia Langford was already seated, her expression neutral, but her posture radiating disapproval. Marcus sat to Evelyn's left, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Ms. Cross, Patricia began, folding her hands on the table. I assume this is about Mr. Hayes. It is. Then I'll save us both some time. The decision has been made. We're terminating his employment effective Friday. He's been warned multiple times, and he continues to violate. I'm creating a new position, Evelyn said, cutting her off. Patricia blinked. Excuse me? A wellness coordinator, someone whose job is to oversee employee support during high-stress projects. Meal programs, mental health resources, mandatory rest protocols. Everything we should have been doing all along. Patricia's expression hardened. Ms. Cross, we already have an employee assistance program, which no one uses because it's buried in a handbook no one reads, and requires 3 levels of approval to access. Evelyn opened the folder and slid a document across the table. This is different. This is proactive. And it's happening. Patricia scanned the document, her lips pressing into a thin line. You're proposing we pay someone to cook meals for the staff. Among other things, yes. That's not a realistic use of company resources. Neither is losing our best engineers because we worked them into the ground. Evelyn leaned forward. We just closed a $240 million deal. You know how close we came to losing it? How many people almost broke trying to make it happen? This isn't charity, Patricia. It's damage control. Marcus shifted in his seat. The data backs it up. Team B, the group Hayes was supporting, had a 40% lower error rate and 0 attrition during the crisis. Team A lost 2 people and nearly missed every deadline. Patricia looked between them, clearly calculating. Even if I agreed to this, which I'm not saying I do, you're talking about a significant budget allocation. The board will never approve it. The board will approve what I tell them to approve, Evelyn said flatly. I just brought in the biggest contract in company history. I've earned some latitude. And you want to spend that latitude on a janitor who cooks chicken in the break room. I want to spend it on making sure we don't lose the people who actually build this company. Evelyn's voice was cold, clipped. Hayes was doing the job we should have been doing, and instead of thanking him, you want to fire him. So here's what's going to happen. We're creating this position. We're implementing these programs. And if you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the board yourself. The room went silent. Patricia stared at her, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. Then she closed the folder and stood. I'll need time to review this. You have 24 hours. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she nodded and walked out without another word. Marcus let out a breath. Well, that was something. Evelyn didn't respond. She was staring at the closed door, her hands shaking slightly. She'd just gone to war with her own HR department over a custodian who probably didn't even want the job. It was reckless. It was impulsive. It was the kind of move that could blow up in her face if she wasn't careful. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like she'd done something right. You think she'll fight you on this? Marcus asked. Probably. And if she does? Evelyn looked at him. Then I'll fight back. That night, Evelyn found herself wandering down to the 32nd floor again. She told herself it was just to check on things, to make sure the team was settling back into a normal rhythm after the chaos of the past few weeks. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. She was looking for Nolan. She found him in the hallway outside the engineering wing, emptying a trash bin with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything. When he saw her, he straightened, wiping his hands on his uniform. Ms. Cross. Hayes. She hesitated, suddenly unsure of what she'd come here to say. You got a minute? He glanced at the half-full trash bag, then set it down. Sure. They walked to the break room in silence. Evelyn poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't want, just to have something to do with her hands. Nolan leaned against the counter, waiting. I talked to HR today, she said finally. And? I'm creating a new position, wellness coordinator. Someone to manage meal programs, mental health support, that kind of thing. She looked at him. I want you to take it. Nolan's expression didn't change. Why? Because you're already doing the job. And because you're better at it than anyone else I could hire. I'm a custodian. You're a chef, a damn good one, from what I read. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady. You really dug into my background, huh? I needed to understand who you were. And what did you find? Evelyn set down her coffee cup. Someone who gave up everything to take care of the people who mattered. Someone who kept showing up even when no one asked you to. She paused. Someone this company doesn't deserve but desperately needs. Nolan looked away, something unreadable crossing his face. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking for a promotion. Why not? Because this job works for me. It's simple, low stress. I clock in, do my work, clock out. I don't have to manage people or deal with office politics or fight battles I didn't sign up for. You're already fighting those battles. On my terms, not because someone's paying me to. Evelyn felt a flicker of frustration. So you'd rather keep mopping floors than actually make a difference? Nolan's eyes snapped back to hers, and for the first time she saw a flash of anger. I am making a difference. Just because it doesn't come with a fancy title doesn't mean it doesn't matter. That's not what I... You want me to take this job because it makes you feel better, because it's a neat solution to a problem you don't know how to fix on your own. But here's the thing, Ms. Cross. I don't exist to make you feel better about the way you run this company. The words hit like a slap. Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Because he was right. She hadn't offered him the job because it was what he wanted. She'd offered it because it was what she needed. Another variable she could control. Another problem she could solve with money and authority. You're right, she said quietly. I'm sorry. Nolan's expression softened slightly. I'm not saying I won't do it. I'm saying I need to think about it. This job, it's not just about cooking meals. It's about changing the way this place works. And that's a fight I'm not sure I want to take on. What if you didn't have to fight it alone? He looked at her, something questioning in his gaze. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm done pretending this company doesn't have a problem. I'm done sacrificing people for profit margins. If you take this job, I'll back you. Whatever you need, budget, authority, protection from HR, you'll have it. Why? Because you were right about everything. About people not being machines. About leadership meaning more than just closing deals. She met his eyes. I built this company by being ruthless. And it worked. But I'm starting to realize that just because something works doesn't mean it's worth the cost. Nolan studied her for a long moment, and Evelyn felt exposed under his gaze. Like he could see straight through the armor she'd spent years building, straight down to the uncertainty and fear she'd never let anyone else see. I'll think about it, he said finally. That's all I'm asking. He nodded and picked up his cleaning supplies, heading for the door. But before he left, he paused and looked back at her. For what it's worth, he said quietly, the fact that you're trying, that means something. Then he was gone, leaving Evelyn alone in the break room with her cold coffee and the echo of his words. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, calls, and paperwork. Patricia came back with a revised proposal for the wellness position, stripped of half the budget and most of the authority Evelyn had outlined. Evelyn pushed back. They fought. Eventually, they reached a compromise that satisfied no one, but at least kept the program alive. The board was harder to convince. Several members questioned the expense, the precedent it set, the optics of creating a position that essentially rewarded someone for breaking the rules. Evelyn stood her ground, leveraging the success of the Meridian deal, the retention data from Team B, the cost of losing senior engineers to burnout and attrition. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't easy, but in the end, they approved it. Nolan still hadn't given her an answer. Evelyn told herself she was fine with that. Told herself she couldn't force him to take a job he didn't want. But every night, when she walked past the break room and saw him quietly packing meals or cleaning counters, she felt the absence of his decision like a weight on her chest. Then, on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after the Meridian signing, everything came crashing down again. Evelyn was in a budget review meeting when her phone started buzzing. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. She glanced at the screen and saw Marcus's name flashing. She excused herself and stepped into the hallway, answering the call. What's wrong? Marcus's voice was tight, strained. We've got a problem. Brandon Lee just collapsed in the parking garage. Paramedics are on the way. Evelyn's blood went cold. What happened? Don't know yet. Security found him unconscious next to his car. He's breathing, but he's not responsive. I'm on my way. She hung up and ran for the elevator, her heart pounding. The garage was in the basement, 3 levels down. By the time she got there, a small crowd had gathered. Security personnel, a few engineers who'd been leaving for the day. And in the center of it all, Brandon Lee, lying on the concrete with a paramedic kneeling beside him, checking his vitals. Evelyn pushed through the crowd. How is he? The paramedic didn't look up. Dehydrated, severely sleep-deprived. Possible malnutrition. We're taking him to County General. Is he going to be okay? Can't say yet, but if he'd gone much longer like this, we'd be looking at organ failure. The words hit Evelyn like a freight train. She stepped back, her hand shaking, and watched as they loaded Brandon onto a stretcher and carried him toward the ambulance. The crowd dispersed slowly, people whispering to each other, casting uneasy glances in her direction. Marcus appeared at her side. This is bad, Evelyn. I know. The board's going to want answers. I know. And HR... I don't care about HR. She turned to face him, her voice hard. We almost killed that kid. We pushed him past his limits, and when he broke, we just kept pushing. This is on us. On me. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just nodded and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the parking garage, staring at the spot where Brandon had been lying. She told herself she was changing, told herself she was trying, but in the end, nothing had actually changed. The policies were the same, the pressure was the same, and now a 24-year-old kid was in an ambulance because she hadn't moved fast enough. Evelyn pulled out her phone and called Nolan. He answered on the third ring. "Miss Cross? Where are you?" "Home." "Why? What's wrong?" "I need your help." There was a pause. "What happened?" "Brandon Lee just collapsed. Paramedics think it's exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition, the works." Her voice cracked slightly. "I can't do this alone anymore, Nolan. I need someone who actually knows how to take care of people. Please." Another pause, longer this time. Then Nolan's voice came back, quiet but steady. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He showed up in 19. Evelyn was still in the garage when he arrived, leaning against a concrete pillar with her arms wrapped around herself. Nolan walked up, still in his street clothes, jeans and a faded button-down, and stopped a few feet away. "You okay?" he asked. "No." He nodded, like that was the answer he'd expected. "Where's the team?" "Upstairs. Most of them don't even know what happened yet." "They need to." Evelyn looked at him. "What?" "They need to know. Not the sanitized HR version. The truth. That one of their own almost died because we pushed too hard." His gaze was unflinching. "If you want things to change, it starts with honesty. The board will lose their minds. Then let them. You can't fix this by pretending it didn't happen." Evelyn wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't that simple, that there were protocols and procedures and legal considerations. But standing there in the cold fluorescent light of the parking garage, she realized he was right. She was done pretending. An hour later, Evelyn stood in front of the entire engineering department, 63 people crammed into the largest conference room on the 32nd floor. The atmosphere was tense, uncertain. Word had spread about Brandon, but the details were still murky and people were scared. Evelyn didn't use notes. She didn't soften the blow. She just told them the truth. "Brandon Lee is in the hospital," she said, her voice steady but raw. "The paramedics said it was severe exhaustion and dehydration. He's stable now, but it was close. Too close." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. "This happened because we've been running this company like people are machines. Because I've been running it that way. And I was wrong." The room was silent. People exchanged glances, but no one spoke. "I stood here 2 months ago and told you that the Meridian deal was non-negotiable, that failure wasn't an option, and you delivered. You gave me everything I asked for and more. But the cost was too high, and I didn't see it until it was almost too late." Sarah Kim was sitting in the front row, her expression guarded. "So, what changes?" "Everything," Evelyn said. "Starting now. We're implementing mandatory rest periods on all high-priority projects. No one works more than 50 hours a week without explicit written approval from me personally. We're bringing in meal support, mental health resources, and a wellness coordinator whose entire job is to make sure this never happens again." "Who's the coordinator?" someone asked from the back. When Evelyn glanced at Nolan, who was standing near the door. He met her eyes and gave a small nod. "Nolan Hayes," she said. "Most of you know him already. He's been keeping some of you fed and functional for the past month. Now he's going to do it officially." A murmur ran through the room. A few people looked confused. Others looked relieved. Sarah was the first to start clapping, and within seconds, the rest of the room joined in. Nolan looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he didn't back down. He stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, and addressed the room. "I'm not going to stand up here and promise you everything's going to be perfect," he said, "because it won't be. Change takes time, and it's messy, and there are going to be days where it feels like nothing's different. But here's what I can promise. I see you. I know what it's like to be pushed past your limits, and I'm not going to let that happen again. Not on my watch." The applause was quieter this time, but it was genuine, and as Evelyn looked around the room, she saw something she hadn't seen in months. Hope. The meeting ended. People filed out slowly, some stopping to shake Nolan's hand or thank him. Evelyn stayed behind, watching from the side of the room as he fielded questions and reassurances with the same calm, steady presence he brought to everything. When the room finally emptied, he walked over to her. "You meant that," he said, "about everything changing." "I did. It's going to be harder than you think." "I know." He studied her for a moment, then held out his hand. "Then I guess we'd better get started." Evelyn shook his hand, feeling the rough calluses of someone who'd spent years working with his hands, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path. The next morning, Brandon Lee woke up in a hospital bed with an IV in his arm and a doctor telling him he was lucky to be alive. Evelyn visited him that afternoon, bringing flowers she'd picked up at the hospital gift shop and an apology she'd been rehearsing the entire drive over. Brandon looked small in the hospital bed, pale and exhausted, but awake. When he saw her, he tried to sit up, but she waved him off. "Don't," she said, pulling up a chair. "Just rest." "Miss Cross, I'm sorry." "Stop." Her voice was firm but not unkind. "You don't get to apologize. I'm the one who's sorry. I pushed you too hard. I didn't see what was happening. And you almost paid the price for my blindness." Brandon blinked, clearly not expecting that. "I should have said something." "You shouldn't have had to. That's the point." She set the flowers on the bedside table. "When you're ready to come back, things are going to be different. I can't undo what happened, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again." He nodded slowly, his eyes damp. "Thank you." Evelyn stayed for another 10 minutes, answering his questions, reassuring him that his job was safe, that he could take all the time he needed to recover. When she finally left, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. But she also felt the weight of everything still left to fix. Over the next 2 weeks, Nolan threw himself into his new role with the same quiet intensity he'd brought to cooking meals in the break room. He met with every department, listened to complaints and suggestions, mapped out where the biggest pain points were. He set up a rotating meal program, partnering with local restaurants to provide subsidized lunches and dinners during crunch periods. He created a resource guide for mental health support, making it accessible and anonymous. He even convinced Evelyn to approve a dedicated rest area on the 32nd floor, couches, dim lighting, a space where people could actually decompress without feeling guilty. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, pushback from managers who didn't see the point, complaints about costs and logistics. But slowly, things started to shift. People started leaving at reasonable hours. The break room stopped being a graveyard of empty energy drink cans. Sarah Kim smiled more. David Tran stopped looking like he was one bad day away from a breakdown. And Evelyn found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, listening. She started walking the floors more often, not to micromanage but to check in. She asked people how they were doing and actually waited for the answer. She learned their names, their projects, their frustrations. It was awkward at first. She wasn't good at small talk, and people were wary of her sudden interest, but over time it got easier. And every now and then she'd catch Nolan watching her from across the room, a faint smile on his face, and she'd feel something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest. Late one evening, 3 weeks after Brandon's collapse, Evelyn found Nolan in the kitchen on the 32nd floor. He was prepping vegetables for the next day's meal service, his movements practiced and precise. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him work. "You're getting good at this," she said. He glanced up, wiping his hands on a towel. "At what?" "The job. Leadership. All of it." Nolan shrugged. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." "That's what leadership is." He smiled faintly. "Maybe." Evelyn walked into the room, pouring herself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd brewed earlier. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you say yes? To the job, I mean. You didn't want it." Nolan set down the knife and leaned against the counter, considering. "You're right. I didn't. But then I saw you in that meeting with the engineers. The way you stood up there and admitted you were wrong. That took guts. And I figured if you were willing to fight for them, the least I could do was show up." Evelyn looked down at her coffee, her throat tight. "I don't know if I'm doing this right." "No one does." "That's not reassuring. It's not supposed to be. Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to figure them out as you go." He met her eyes. "You're doing better than you think." Evelyn wanted to believe him. wanted to trust that the changes they were making mattered, that they weren't just putting a fresh coat of paint on a fundamentally broken system. But doubt still gnawed at her, stubborn and relentless. "What if it's not enough?" she asked quietly. Nolan tilted his head. "Then we do more. We keep trying. We mess up, we fix it, and we keep going. That's all anyone can do." He made it sound so simple. And maybe, in a way, it was. Evelyn finished her coffee and set the cup in the sink. "Thank you for this, for everything. You don't have to keep thanking me." "I know, but I'm going to anyway." Nolan smiled, and for the first time, Evelyn felt like maybe they were building something real, something that might actually last. She left him to his work and headed back to her office, but as she walked through the quiet halls of halcyon dynamics, she realized something had shifted. The building didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a place where people actually worked, where they mattered, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt like she mattered too. The changes didn't come easy. Evelyn had expected resistance, but she hadn't anticipated just how deep the rot went. Middle management fought her at every turn, not openly, but through passive aggression and bureaucratic delay. Project timelines that should have taken days to approve suddenly required weeks of review. Budget requests disappeared into black holes of committee meetings. Department heads smiled to her face and then undermined her policies the moment she left the room. It was exhausting and infuriating, and some days Evelyn wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The worst of it came from Richard Voss, the VP of Engineering. He was in his late 50s, a company veteran who'd been with Halcyon since the early days, back when it was still a scrappy startup operating out of a converted warehouse. He'd helped build the culture that Evelyn was now trying to dismantle, and he didn't appreciate it. She was in a project review meeting when he made his move. The room was packed with senior staff: Marcus, Patricia from HR, several department heads, and Richard sitting at the far end of the table with his arms crossed and a look on his face that said he was done playing nice. "I have concerns," Richard said, cutting off Marcus mid-sentence. Evelyn looked up from the report she'd been reading. "About?" "This wellness initiative. It's eating into productivity. Team output is down 15% since we implemented the mandatory rest periods." "Team output was artificially inflated because people were working themselves into the ground," Evelyn said evenly. "What we're seeing now is sustainable performance. Sustainable doesn't win contracts. Neither do burned-out employees who can't function." Richard leaned forward, his expression hardening. "With all due respect, Evelyn, you're treating this company like a charity. We're in a competitive industry. If we slow down, someone else will eat our lunch." "We're not slowing down, we're adjusting our approach." "To what? Coddling people who can't handle the pressure?" The room went quiet. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Patricia was staring at her tablet like she could will herself into disappearing. Evelyn set down her pen and met Richard's gaze head on. "Brandon Lee almost died in our parking garage because we pushed him past his limits. That's not handling pressure, that's abuse." That was one isolated incident. It wasn't isolated. We've lost 8 engineers in the last 6 months. 8. All of them citing burnout and unsustainable working conditions. How many more do we need to lose before you admit we have a problem? Richard's jaw tightened. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. And you're letting pride cloud yours." The air between them crackled with tension. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might actually walk out. Instead, he sat back, his expression cold. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "And when this company starts losing ground because you prioritize feelings over results, I hope you're prepared to explain it to the board." He stood and left without waiting for a response. The meeting continued, but the damage was done. Evelyn could feel the unease rippling through the room, the quiet calculations everyone was making about which side to be on. She powered through the rest of the agenda, but by the time it ended, she felt like she'd gone 3 rounds in a boxing ring. Marcus caught up with her in the hallway afterward. "That was rough." "He's not wrong about the productivity numbers. He's not right either. The data's more complicated than he's making it sound." Evelyn rubbed her temples. "I know, but perception matters. If the board starts thinking I'm tanking the company, then you show them the retention numbers, the error rates, the employee satisfaction scores. You've got the data to back this up, Evelyn. Don't let Richard bully you into second-guessing yourself." She wanted to believe him, but doubt was a stubborn thing. and it had settled in her chest like a stone. That evening, she found herself in Nolan's kitchen again. He was preparing a batch of stir-fry for the next day's lunch service, the smell of garlic and ginger filling the air. He glanced up when she walked in, taking in her expression with a single look. "Bad day?" he asked. "Is it that obvious?" "You've got that look, like you're one more problem away from flipping a table." Evelyn almost smiled. "Richard Voss thinks I'm running this company into the ground." "Richard Voss has been running people into the ground for 2 decades. His opinion doesn't matter." "It does if he convinces the board he's right." Nolan set down his spatula and turned to face her. "Are you asking me if you're doing the right thing?" "Maybe." "Then here's your answer. You are. It's messy and it's hard, and there are going to be people who fight you every step of the way, but that doesn't mean you're wrong." "How do you know?" "Because I see what's happening on the ground level. People are sleeping again. They're eating real meals. They're not showing up to work looking like they're about to collapse." "That's not sentiment, Evelyn. That's results." She leaned against the counter, watching him work. There was something calming about the rhythm of it, the precise movements, the quiet focus. It reminded her that not everything had to be a battle. Some things could just be simple. "You make it look easy," she said. "It's not. I just don't overthink it." "Must be nice." He smiled faintly. "You overthink because you care. That's not a bad thing. It just means you need to trust yourself more." Evelyn didn't know how to respond to that, so she just stood there, letting the warmth of the kitchen and the smell of the food and Nolan's steady presence ease some of the tension coiled in her chest. After a moment, he handed her a spoon. "Here, make yourself useful." She blinked. "What?" "Taste this. Tell me if it needs more soy sauce." Evelyn took the spoon, dipped it into the pan, and tasted. The flavors were sharp and balanced, the vegetables still crisp. "It's good." "Just good?" "It's really good." "Then it doesn't need more soy sauce." She handed the spoon back and their fingers brushed for just a second. It was nothing, a fleeting accidental touch, but Evelyn felt it all the way down to her bones. She pulled her hand back quickly, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Nolan didn't seem to notice. He just went back to cooking, humming softly under his breath. Evelyn left a few minutes later, but the warmth of that moment stayed with her all the way home. The backlash from Richard came sooner than she expected. 2 days after their confrontation, he sent an email to the entire executive team outlining his concerns about the wellness initiative, complete with cherry-picked data and a thinly veiled suggestion that Evelyn's leadership had become compromised. It was a political hit job, and everyone knew it. Evelyn sat in her office, reading the email for the 3rd time, and felt her blood boil. She wanted to fire him, wanted to walk into his office, tell him exactly what she thought of his petty power play, and escort him out of the building. But she couldn't. Richard had allies on the board, long-standing relationships that predated her tenure as CEO. If she made a move against him without ironclad justification, it would look like retaliation, and that would give his narrative credibility. So instead, she did what she did best. She built a case. She spent the next week gathering data, pulling reports, and interviewing employees. She documented every success story, engineers who'd come back from the brink, teams whose performance had improved under the new policies, retention rates that were finally starting to stabilize. She compiled it all into a presentation that was part defense, part counterattack. And then she called a board meeting. The conference room on the executive floor was all glass and steel, designed to intimidate. 10 board members sat around the table, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. Richard was there too, sitting near the far end with a faint smirk on his face. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, her laptop connected to the projector, and launched into her presentation without preamble. "I'm here to address the concerns raised about our wellness initiative," she said. "But before I do, I want to remind everyone what this company looked like 3 months ago." She clicked to the first slide, a graph showing employee turnover rates. The line spiked sharply upward over the past year, peaking just before the Meridian deal. "We were hemorrhaging talent. 8 engineers in 6 months. Our attrition rate was 3 times the industry average. And it was costing us, not just in recruitment and training costs, but in lost productivity, institutional knowledge, and team morale." She clicked to the next slide, performance metrics from Team B versus Team A during the Meridian crisis. This is what happened when we started providing basic support. Team B, which received meal assistance and had access to Nolan Hayes, outperformed Team A by every measurable metric. Lower error rates, faster problem resolution, zero attrition. Meanwhile, Team A, which operated under our traditional model, lost 2 people and nearly missed every deadline. Richard shifted in his seat. Evelyn didn't look at him. Since implementing the wellness initiative, our retention rate has improved by 30%. Employee satisfaction scores are up. Sick days are down. And our productivity, contrary to what's been suggested, is not tanking. It's stabilizing at a sustainable level. She clicked to the final slide, a cost-benefit analysis. Yes, this program costs money, but it costs significantly less than the alternative. Recruiting a senior engineer costs an average of $80,000 when you factor in headhunting fees, onboarding, and lost productivity during the ramp-up period. We've already saved more than $500,000 just by keeping the people we have. She closed the laptop and looked around the table. This isn't about coddling anyone. It's about recognizing that our people are our most valuable asset, and assets perform better when they're maintained. Silence. Then one of the board members, a woman named Helen Travers, who'd been with the company since the beginning, spoke up. What about Richard's concerns regarding competitive positioning? Evelyn met her gaze. We just closed the largest contract in company history. Our competitors are still trying to figure out how we did it. If that's what losing ground looks like, I'll take it. A few people smiled. Richard didn't. Helen leaned back in her chair, considering. I'd like to see this continue for another quarter. If the numbers hold, we revisit the budget allocation. If they don't, we reassess. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was enough. Evelyn nodded. Agreed. The meeting ended shortly after. As people filed out, Richard approached her, his expression unreadable. You're betting your career on this, he said quietly. I know. I hope you're right. So do I. He walked away without another word, and Evelyn stood there, feeling the weight of what she'd just done settle over her shoulders. She'd won this round, but the war was far from over. Later that week, Brandon Lee came back to work. He walked into the engineering wing, looking thinner than before, still a little pale, but alive. The team welcomed him back with quiet relief. No fanfare or speeches, just the kind of understated support that came from people who'd been through the same thing. Evelyn watched from the doorway as Sarah handed him a meal container, one of Nolan's, and said something that made him laugh. It was a small moment, barely worth noticing, but it meant everything. She found Nolan in his office later that afternoon. It wasn't much. A converted storage room on the 32nd floor with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a small refrigerator. But he'd made it his own. Photos of his daughter pinned to a corkboard. A coffee maker that looked older than Evelyn. A whiteboard covered in meal plans and resource lists. He looked up when she knocked. Hey, you surviving? Barely. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Brandon's back. I know. I talked to him this morning. He looks good. He looks like he's been through hell. He has, but he's still standing. That's what matters. Evelyn sat down in the chair across from his desk. The board gave us another quarter. If the numbers hold, the program stays. And if they don't, then I'm probably out of a job. Nolan studied her for a moment. You really think they'd fire you? I think they'd find a way to push me out. Force a resignation. Something clean and corporate. She shrugged. Doesn't matter. I made my choice. Was it worth it? She thought about Brandon laughing with Sarah, about the engineers who were finally sleeping again, about the quiet shift in the building's atmosphere, less frantic, less desperate. Yeah, she said quietly. It was. Nolan smiled. Good, because there's no going back now. I know. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Evelyn realized something had changed between them. It wasn't just professional anymore. Somewhere along the way, Nolan had stopped being the custodian who challenged her and become something else. A partner, maybe. Or a friend. Or something she didn't have a name for yet. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Why do you still work nights? You've got a real job now. You could switch to a normal schedule. Nolan leaned back in his chair. Habit, mostly. And I've been working nights for so long it feels weird to think about doing anything else. Plus, there's something peaceful about it. The building's quieter, less chaos. Don't you miss having a life outside of work? He laughed softly. What life? My daughter's in college 3 states away. I don't have hobbies. I don't date. This is my life. That's depressing. Is it? He tilted his head. You work 70-hour weeks and live in a penthouse you probably spend 10 hours a week in. How is your life any different? Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Because he was right. She'd built an empire and filled it with nothing but work. No friends, no relationships, no hobbies or passions or anything that made her feel human. When did we become such cliches? She asked. Probably around the same time we stopped paying attention. She smiled despite herself. You ever think about doing something different? Going back to cooking full-time? Sometimes, but that life's behind me. I made my peace with it. You don't miss it? I miss parts of it. The creativity, the rhythm, the way a kitchen feels when everything's firing on all cylinders. He paused. But I don't miss the pressure, the egos, the constant fight to prove yourself. This job, what I'm doing now, it's different. It matters in a way that cooking for rich people never did. Evelyn understood that, more than she wanted to admit. For what it's worth, she said, you're good at this. Better than anyone I could have hired. Coming from you, that actually means something. Don't let it go to your head. He grinned, and Evelyn felt that warmth in her chest again, the one that scared her because it felt too much like hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, reports, and small victories. The wellness program expanded. Nolan hired an assistant, a former social worker named Maya Chen, who had a gift for connecting with people and an even better gift for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense. Together, they built out mental health resources, established peer support groups, and created a system where employees could flag concerns before they turned into crises. It wasn't perfect. There were still long hours, still tight deadlines, still the inevitable stress that came with working in a high-stakes industry. But the culture was changing. People were talking to each other more, asking for help instead of suffering in silence, taking breaks without feeling guilty. And slowly, grudgingly, even Richard Voss started to come around. He didn't apologize. Evelyn didn't expect him to. But he stopped actively sabotaging her efforts, started acknowledging the data, even implemented some of the wellness policies in his own department. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was progress. One evening in late spring, Evelyn was working late when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. It was nearly 9 and she was exhausted, but the number was local and something made her pick up. Miss Cross, this is County General. We have a patient here asking for you. Evelyn's blood went cold. Who? Nolan Hayes. He was brought in about an hour ago. Her heart stopped. What happened? He collapsed at work. We're still running tests, but it appears to be exhaustion related. He's stable, but he's asking for you. Evelyn was already grabbing her coat. I'm on my way. She made it to the hospital in 15 minutes, breaking at least 3 traffic laws in the process. The ER was a chaos of bright lights and beeping machines, and people in scrubs moving with controlled urgency. She found Nolan in a curtained-off bay, hooked up to an IV, looking pale and annoyed. You're an idiot, she said the moment she saw him. He looked up, a faint smile on his face. Good to see you too. What the hell happened? Overdid it? Skipped a few meals? Didn't sleep enough? The usual? Evelyn pulled up a chair and sat down, her hands shaking. You lectured me about taking care of people and then you pull this? I know. Ironic, right? It's not funny. It's a little funny. She glared at him, but the anger was already fading, replaced by fear and relief and something deeper she didn't want to name. The doctor said you're staying overnight for observation, she said. I know. I tried to argue, didn't work. Good. They sat in silence for a moment, then Nolan spoke, his voice quieter. I'm sorry, I should have been more careful. Yeah, you should have. Evelyn looked down at her hands. You scared the hell out of me. I scared myself. What were you thinking? I was thinking I had work to do, people counting on me. Same thing you think every time you push yourself too hard. She couldn't argue with that, so she just sat there, holding his gaze, and let herself feel the weight of how much he'd come to matter. You need to take your own advice, she said finally. So do you. I'm working on it. Me too. The nurse came in then, checking vitals and asking questions. Evelyn stepped out to give them privacy, but she didn't leave. She couldn't. not until she knew he was okay. An hour later, they moved him to a room upstairs. Evelyn followed, ignoring the visiting hours policy, and settled into the chair by his bed. Nolan was already half asleep, the exhaustion finally catching up with him. "You don't have to stay," he mumbled. "I know. But you're going to anyway." "Yeah." He smiled faintly and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing evened out, and Evelyn sat there in the quiet hospital room watching him sleep and feeling something shift inside her. For 15 years, she'd built her life around control, around certainty, around the belief that if she just worked hard enough, planned well enough, stayed ruthless enough, she could protect herself from the chaos of caring too much. But sitting here now, watching Nolan Hayes sleep in a hospital bed because he'd given too much of himself to people who needed him, she realized she'd been wrong. Caring wasn't weakness. It was the hardest, bravest thing a person could do. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn let herself care without trying to control it, without trying to justify it or analyze it or fit it into some grand strategic plan. She just let it be. When Nolan woke up a few hours later, she was still there. "You're stubborn," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Look who's talking." He laughed softly, then winced. "Remind me not to do that." "Remind yourself. You're the wellness coordinator. Physician, heal thyself, right?" Something like that. They fell into comfortable silence again, and Evelyn realized that this quiet, unglamorous moment in a sterile hospital room mattered more than any board meeting or contract signing ever had. Because this was real. This was human. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Nolan was discharged the next morning with strict instructions to rest, eat properly, and stop acting like he was invincible. The doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 40s who'd probably seen 1,000 cases just like his, handed him a stack of aftercare instructions and gave Evelyn a pointed look. "Make sure he actually follows these," she said. "I will," Evelyn promised. Nolan rolled his eyes. "I'm standing right here." "And yet you still need a babysitter." The doctor signed off on his discharge papers and left without waiting for a response. Evelyn drove him home. A small apartment in a neighborhood she'd never visited, the kind of place where people actually knew their neighbors and kids played in the street. It was modest, clean, nothing like the sterile luxury of her own penthouse. When they pulled up to the curb, Nolan hesitated before opening the door. "You don't have to come up," he said. "I know, but you're going to anyway." "Yeah." His apartment was on the second floor, up a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. Inside, it was exactly what she'd expected. Functional, uncluttered, filled with the quiet evidence of a life lived simply. A worn couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, framed photos of his daughter at various ages, her smile bright and familiar in every shot. Evelyn stood in the doorway, suddenly unsure of what to do with herself. This was Nolan's space, his refuge, and she felt like an intruder. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the couch. "I'll make coffee." "You're supposed to be resting." "It's coffee, not surgery." He was already moving toward the kitchen, ignoring her protest. Evelyn sat, her gaze drifting around the room. There was a stack of cookbooks on the coffee table, their spines cracked and worn from use. A blanket draped over the arm of the couch. A pair of reading glasses sitting next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. It was the kind of home that felt lived in, warm in a way hers never had. Nolan returned a few minutes later with 2 mugs and handed her one before settling into the chair across from her. They drank in silence, the morning light filtering through the window, and Evelyn felt something settle in her chest, something that felt uncomfortably close to peace. "Thank you," Nolan said finally, "for staying last night. You didn't have to." "I wanted to." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why?" Evelyn stared down at her coffee, turning the mug in her hands. "Because the idea of you being alone in that hospital scared me, and I didn't want to leave until I knew you were okay." "Evelyn, I know what you're going to say, that it's not my responsibility, that I don't owe you anything, but that's not why I stayed." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I stayed because I care. About you. About what happens to you. And I'm done pretending I don't." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something neither of them had named yet. Nolan set down his mug, leaning forward slightly. "I care about you too," he said quietly. "More than I probably should." "Why shouldn't you?" Because you're my boss. Because this could complicate everything we've built. Because... He stopped, shaking his head. Because I'm not good at this. At letting people in. I haven't been since Emily died. Evelyn's throat tightened. I'm not good at it either. I spent 15 years building walls so high, I forgot there was supposed to be anything on the other side. So what do we do? I don't know. Figure it out as we go? Nolan smiled faintly. That sounds terrifying. It is. But you're willing to try? Yeah, I am. He stood, crossing the space between them, and held out his hand. Evelyn took it, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers, and let him pull her to her feet. They stood there close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his eyes, the faint lines around his mouth from years of smiling. This is going to be messy, he said. Everything worth doing is. And complicated. I run a multi-million-dollar company. I can handle complicated. Nolan laughed softly, and the sound eased something in Evelyn's chest. Then, slowly, carefully, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sweep you off your feet cinematic. It was quiet and tentative and real, and Evelyn felt it all the way down to her bones. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. We're really doing this, she whispered. Looks like it. What happens now? Now? You go back to work. I rest like the doctor ordered, and we take it one day at a time. Evelyn opened her eyes, searching his face. That's it? That's it. No grand plan, no strategy, just see where it goes. For someone who'd spent her entire life controlling every variable, the idea should have terrified her. But standing here in Nolan's apartment, his hand still in hers, it didn't. It felt like freedom. The next few weeks unfolded in a way Evelyn hadn't anticipated. Work continued. Contracts, meetings, the endless grind of keeping a company running. But something had shifted. She left the office at reasonable hours. She answered emails in the morning instead of at midnight. She started saying no to things that didn't matter and yes to things that did. And she spent time with Nolan, not just at work, but outside of it. Dinners at his apartment where he cooked and she set the table. Walks through the city on Sunday mornings. Quiet evenings on his couch with no agenda other than being together. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unfamiliar. But it was also the first time in years that Evelyn felt like she was living instead of just surviving. The company noticed. Marcus commented on it first, catching her smiling at her phone during a budget meeting. You seem different, he said afterward. Different how? Lighter, less like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Evelyn shrugged, trying to play it off. Maybe I'm just getting better at delegating. Marcus gave her a look that said he didn't buy it for a second, but he didn't push. Whatever it is, keep doing it. It's working. He wasn't wrong. The quarterly review came back strong. Retention rates were holding steady. Employee satisfaction scores were the highest they'd been in 5 years. Even the productivity metrics, Richard's precious numbers, were trending upward as people settled into the new rhythm. The board approved continued funding for the wellness program. Helen Travers even pulled Evelyn aside after the meeting to tell her she'd been impressed. I'll admit I had my doubts, Helen said. But you were right. This company needed to change, and you had the guts to make it happen. Evelyn didn't tell her it hadn't been guts. It had been desperation, and Nolan. Mostly Nolan. But she accepted the compliment and moved forward because that's what you did. You kept going. In late summer, Nolan's daughter came home for a visit. Claire was 22, bright and opinionated, with her father's calm demeanor and her mother's sharp wit. Evelyn met her on a Saturday afternoon at Nolan's apartment, and the moment felt monumental in a way she hadn't expected. Claire shook her hand with a firm grip and an appraising look. So you're the woman who convinced my dad to stop hiding behind a mop? Evelyn blinked. I'm not sure I'd phrase it that way. I would. Claire glanced at Nolan, who was setting out lunch in the kitchen. He's been stuck for years, doing work he was overqualified for because it was safe and didn't ask anything of him. You changed that. He changed himself. I just gave him the opportunity. Claire smiled. That's diplomatic. I like you. They spent the afternoon together. Lunch, conversation, stories about Claire's college life and her plans for the future. She was studying social work, which didn't surprise Evelyn at all. Nolan had raised her to care about people, to see the world as something you could improve if you just paid attention. As Evelyn watched them together, father and daughter, easy and comfortable in each other's presence, she felt something ache in her chest. Not envy, exactly, more like recognition of something she'd never had. Family. The kind of bond that wasn't transactional or strategic, but simply there. Later, when Claire stepped out to take a phone call, Nolan caught Evelyn's expression. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah, just thinking." About? About how different your life is from mine. You have this whole history, this person you raised and shaped. I have a company and an empty apartment. Nolan sat down beside her on the couch. You have more than that. Do I? You have people who respect you, who are better off because you fought for them. You have a whole building full of lives you've changed. He took her hand. And you have me, if you want me. Evelyn looked at him, at the quiet certainty in his eyes, and felt her throat tighten. I do. Want you, I mean. Then that's enough. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that she didn't have to earn love the way she earned everything else. But 15 years of habit didn't disappear overnight. Claire came back inside, breaking the moment, and the afternoon continued. When Evelyn finally left that evening, Claire hugged her at the door. Take care of him, she said quietly. He acts tough, but he's not as invincible as he thinks. I know, neither am I, Claire smiled. Good. Then you're perfect for each other. The words stayed with Evelyn all the way home. Fall brought new challenges. A competitor tried to poach 3 of their senior engineers with aggressive salary offers. A supply chain issue threatened to delay a major project. Richard Voss announced his retirement, citing health reasons, though everyone knew it was really because he'd lost the power struggle and didn't want to stick around to watch Evelyn's vision take root. But through it all, the company held. The wellness program became standard operating procedure. Maya Chen hired 2 more assistants to handle the workload. The peer support groups expanded. Mental health days became a thing people actually used without guilt or fear of reprisal. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Halcyon Dynamics transformed from a pressure cooker into something that resembled a sustainable workplace. It wasn't perfect. People still worked hard, still faced stress and tight deadlines, but they weren't breaking anymore. They weren't running on empty. They were just working, the way work was supposed to be. In October, 6 months after Nolan's collapse, Evelyn stood in front of the entire company at the annual all-hands meeting. It was held in the building's largest conference center, packed wall to wall with employees from every department. She'd given this speech a dozen times before, updates on performance, goals for the coming year, the usual corporate pep talk. But this time was different. She stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and realized she actually knew some of them now. Sarah Kim in the 3rd row, looking healthier than she had in years. David Tran near the back, laughing at something his neighbor said. Brandon Lee, sitting front and center, fully recovered and back to his brilliant, focused self. And Nolan, standing off to the side with Maya, watching her with that quiet, steady presence that had become her anchor. 6 months ago, Evelyn began, I stood in front of the engineering team and admitted I'd been running this company the wrong way, that I'd prioritized results over people, and that it almost cost us everything. The room was silent, attentive. I'm not going to stand here and tell you everything's perfect now. It's not. We still have long hours and hard projects and deadlines that make us want to scream. But what we don't have anymore is a culture that treats burnout like a badge of honor. We don't have people collapsing in parking garages or quitting without notice because they can't take it anymore. She paused, letting the words land. We have that because of one person who refused to accept that suffering was just part of the job, who showed up every night with meals he'd cooked on his own time, for people who weren't his responsibility because he believed they deserved better. Nolan Hayes didn't just feed our team, he reminded us what it means to actually care about the people we work with. Applause rippled through the room. Nolan looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he didn't look away. This company is stronger now because we finally stopped pretending people are machines, because we built systems that support instead of exploit, because we learned that leadership isn't about demanding more. It's about seeing when people have nothing left to give and giving them what they need to recover. Evelyn's gaze swept across the room, landing on faces she recognized and ones she didn't. I spent 15 years believing that strength meant never bending, never compromising, never showing weakness. And I was wrong. Real strength is admitting when you're wrong. Real strength is changing course when the path you're on is breaking people. Real strength is caring more about the humans in this building than the numbers on a spreadsheet. The applause was louder this time, sustained. Evelyn felt something crack in her chest, not breaking, but opening, letting something out that had been trapped there for too long. "So here's my promise to you," she said, her voice steady. "I will never stop fighting for this company, but I will also never stop fighting for you. Because without you, there is no company. There's just empty desks and broken dreams and all the money in the world that doesn't mean a damn thing if no one's around to spend it." She stepped back from the podium as the room erupted in applause. People stood, some of them wiping their eyes, others just clapping until their hands hurt. It wasn't the kind of reaction Evelyn was used to. Not polite corporate acknowledgement, but genuine human connection. When the meeting ended, people swarmed her. Handshakes, thank yous, stories about how the wellness program had helped them through rough patches. Evelyn took it all in, overwhelmed but grateful, until finally the crowd thinned and she found herself standing alone near the back of the room. Nolan walked up, his hands in his pockets. "That was some speech. You think it was too much?" "I think it was honest. And that's more than most CEOs ever manage." Evelyn smiled. "I had a good teacher." "I didn't teach you that. You figured it out yourself." "Maybe, but I wouldn't have figured it out without you." Nolan looked at her for a long moment, something soft and vulnerable in his expression. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you're exactly the kind of leader this company needs. Not because you have all the answers, but because you're willing to ask the hard questions and actually listen to the answers." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "I'm still figuring it out. We all are. That's the point." They stood there in the emptying conference room, the noise of departing employees fading into the background, and Evelyn realized something. She wasn't lonely anymore. For 15 years, she'd built an empire and lived in it alone. She'd convinced herself that isolation was the price of success, that you couldn't lead effectively if you let people get too close. But standing here now, with Nolan beside her and a company full of people who actually trusted her, she understood the truth. Leadership wasn't about standing above everyone else. It was about standing with them, seeing them, fighting for them, and trusting them to fight back when you needed it. It was messy and complicated and required more vulnerability than she'd ever been comfortable with, but it was also the only thing that mattered. Winter came early that year, bringing with it shorter days and the kind of cold that settled into your bones. Evelyn found herself spending more time at Nolan's apartment, drawn by the warmth of his kitchen and the quiet comfort of his presence. They cooked together, her chopping vegetables while he seasoned and stirred, their movements falling into an easy rhythm that felt like something they'd been doing for years instead of months. One evening in December, Evelyn walked into his kitchen and found him preparing a meal she recognized. The same chicken dish he'd been making that first night she'd confronted him in the break room. The smell brought everything rushing back. The anger, the confusion, the slow unraveling of everything she thought she knew about herself. "You're making that again," she said. Nolan glanced up. "Felt right. Full circle, you know." Evelyn leaned against the counter, watching him work. "A lot's changed since then." "Yeah, it has." "You ever regret it? Taking the job, dealing with all the corporate mess?" Nolan was quiet for a moment, stirring the pot thoughtfully. "No, it's been hard, and there are days I want to throw something at Patricia from HR. But no, I don't regret it." "Why not?" He looked at her, his expression open. "Because it mattered. Because I got to help people who needed it, and because I met you." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. "I'm not easy to be with." "Neither am I. I work too much. I overthink everything. I'm still learning how to be a person instead of just a CEO. And I'm a 51-year-old widower who spent the last 7 years hiding from life. We're a mess, Evelyn, but we're a mess together. And that's something." She crossed the space between them, slipping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his shoulder. He held her, one hand still holding the spoon, and they stood there while the chicken simmered and the winter wind rattled the windows. "I love you," Evelyn said quietly. The words felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar and terrifying, but true. Nolan set down the spoon and turned to face her fully, his hands cupping her face. "I love you too." They kissed, slow and unhurried, and Evelyn let herself fall into it, Let herself trust that this was real, that it wouldn't disappear if she stopped controlling every variable. When they pulled apart, Nolan smiled. You know what this means, right? What? You're stuck with me. No backing out now. I can live with that. Good. Because I'm not going anywhere. They finished cooking dinner together, and when they sat down to eat, Evelyn realized something. This simple, ordinary moment of sharing a meal with someone she loved was worth more than every contract she'd ever signed, every deal she'd ever closed, every accolade she'd ever received. Because this was what it meant to be human. Not building empires or conquering markets, but finding someone who saw you, really saw you, and chose to stay anyway. Spring arrived with the kind of warmth that felt like a promise. Halcyon Dynamics was in the middle of a major expansion, securing contracts with 2 new defense contractors and opening a satellite office on the West Coast. The company was thriving, not in spite of the changes Evelyn had made, but because of them. Brandon Lee was promoted to lead engineer on the new project. Sarah Kim took over as head of systems integration. The retention rate held steady at 93%, the highest in the company's history. And in the kitchen on the 32nd floor, the same one where everything had started, Nolan was preparing lunch for a team gearing up for a deadline. But this time he wasn't alone. Evelyn stood beside him, chopping vegetables with the kind of focus she usually reserved for board meetings. She wasn't good at it yet. Her cuts were uneven, her technique clumsy, but she was trying, and Nolan, patient as ever, guided her through it. Smaller pieces, he said, demonstrating. Like this. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the knife and tried again. Better, but still not great. You're overthinking it, Nolan said, amusement in his voice. I overthink everything. I know, but cooking isn't about perfection. It's about showing up and doing your best. Evelyn paused, looking at him. Is that a metaphor? Maybe. Does it work? She smiled. Yeah, it does. They worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm of chopping and stirring filling the space between them. Around them, the building hummed with life. People working, collaborating, taking breaks without guilt. It wasn't perfect. There were still stressful days, still conflicts and challenges, and the inevitable friction of running a company, but it was better. And better was enough. When the meal was ready, Nolan handed Evelyn a spoon. Want a taste? She dipped it into the pot, tasted, and nodded. It's good. Just good? It's really good. He grinned. You're learning. They carried the food out to the team, distributing containers and fielding thank yous. People asked questions, made jokes, treated them not like CEO and wellness coordinator, but like people. Just 2 people who cared enough to show up. When the kitchen was empty again, Evelyn and Nolan stood side by side, looking out the window at the city below. The late afternoon sun cast everything in gold, and for a moment the world felt still. You ever think about where we'd be if you hadn't walked into that break room that night? Nolan asked. Evelyn considered. Probably the same place. Me burning out slowly, running a company I didn't recognize. You cooking meals in secret and pretending it was enough. Think we would have figured it out eventually? Maybe, but I'm glad we didn't have to. Nolan took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Me too. They stood there, watching the city, and Evelyn thought about everything that had changed in the past year. The fights she'd fought, the walls she'd torn down, the person she'd become when she finally stopped pretending strength meant never needing anyone. She thought about the people in this building, people who were sleeping better, eating better, living better, because someone had finally cared enough to see them as more than productivity metrics. And she thought about Nolan, who'd given up everything to care for his daughter, and then, years later, had shown up to care for strangers because it was the right thing to do. There was a lesson in that. Something about how the hardest thing in the world isn't building empires or closing deals or proving you're the smartest person in the room. The hardest thing is seeing another person's pain and choosing to do something about it, not because it benefits you, not because there's a strategic advantage, but because suffering shouldn't be ignored when you have the power to ease it. Evelyn had spent 15 years learning how to lead through force and control. It had taken Nolan Hayes, a widowed chef working night shifts as a custodian, to teach her what leadership actually meant. It meant showing up. It meant seeing people. It meant caring when it was inconvenient, fighting when it was hard, and admitting when you were wrong. It meant being human. And as Evelyn stood in that kitchen, Nolan's hand in hers and the sun setting over the city she'd conquered and nearly destroyed, she finally understood. She hadn't won by building the biggest empire or closing the most deals. She'd won by learning how to see the people standing right in front of her, by letting herself be seen in return, by choosing every single day to care. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she started this company. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the one she had. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.